Welcome back. Today is Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving. And we are pre-recording because tomorrow we will all be together celebrating one of the most important holidays in the American tradition. I know I said something about Thanksgiving a few weeks back, but I want to say a couple of words again. Thanksgiving. A few weeks ago, I read in the newspaper a story of a little girl who came home and told her mother that Thanksgiving celebrated the day when the Pilgrim Fathers gave thanks to the Indians for helping them get through the winter. And the mother called up the principal of the school and complained and said, "My daughter has been taught something that is not true. Thanksgiving is the day when we celebrate the time when the Pilgrim Fathers gave thanks to God for saving them through the winter." And the principal replied to the mother, "Well, that's your opinion, but the opinion that they gave thanks to the Indians is just as valid." So we have a situation in the United States where postmodern thought is all the way down at the very youngest levels of education of children, teaching them something about history that is patently false. And I believe that America, the United States, is as good as we are, and sometimes that's not as good as I would like us to be, but we are as good as we are because of our heritage, our traditions that have been handed down for hundreds of years. And most of those traditions have to do with God and Christianity. And these days, the school system is teaching that America was secular from the start, and that Christianity did not play a role. But we have a population that is moral and kind and generous. And I believe it comes down from the Christian traditions. So tomorrow, at my house, we are going to have lots of people. We've invited about 25 or 30 people for supper, and maybe more will come because we had an open invitation. And we will celebrate the goodness of God, and we will talk about what we have to be thankful to God for. And we will also speak to our young people, our teenagers, and we will encourage them to be thankful and to give thanks to God for the opportunities they have as Americans. And the old will teach the young, and we will continue our tradition tomorrow. And maybe we will record some greetings to you from the people at our house, which will include Olavo's family and our Brazilian friends, as well as our Spanish friends who are studying English with me and their families, and some American friends. So I'm hoping we will have the opportunity to record for you some special greetings and give you the chance to hear English accents other than mine. So keep an eye on the website and see if something pops up. Maybe we'll send you some greetings. Okay, let's get back to the book. We ended with page 49 last week, and we studied most of the page. And I will reread for you right now the passage that we studied, and then we will go straight into the next passage. And I want to, before I begin, I want to read to you the first sentence of the passage that we will study today. Look on page 49 at the bottom of the page, the first sentence of the last paragraph. It begins with these considerations. I just want to read that one sentence before I begin our review. The sentence says, "These considerations have obvious bearings on the study in the spirit represented by the discipline of thought for which I contend, of literature, the supreme creative art of language." Now I want to point out that the beginning of this sentence is the words, "these considerations." And the first question we will ask ourselves is, what considerations? The considerations are the main points of the paragraphs we studied last week, which I am about to read. So when I read it, try to hear the main points. Try to think, when we get to this line, these considerations, ... have an answer as to what these considerations he is referring to. Okay, so with that in mind, let us review the two paragraphs we studied last week. I'll begin reading on page 49 with the words human responsibility, and you are listening for main ideas and themes. So I'm going to erase the board, and I'm going to write up main ideas and themes. And you can keep track of your ideas on paper when you come up with main ideas or themes, because this is pre-recorded. So you can stop the transmission at any moment, write something down, and turn it back on. That is a luxury that you have today that you don't normally have. So you can give thanks. Have Thanksgiving. So, stop the transition if you hear main ideas and themes. And then after I finish reading, we'll write some up. I wish that you could call them in on the chat board or email, but you'll be limited to mine since it's pre-recorded. Okay, I'm reading. Human responsibility, as known to Lawrence and Conrad, we know they knew because they are great creative writers, is the manifest potency of life. Lawrence wrote in an early letter, "I can't forgive Conrad for being so sad and for giving in." And it is true that in knowing that he didn't belong to himself, Lawrence had, going with his strong sense of belonging, a positive annung of the nature of what he belonged to. one wouldn't confidently impute a comparable sense to Conrad. But one is sure that Conrad, too, would have said of such works as The Secret Sharer, The Shadow Line, and the great novels, "Though I call them mine, I know they are not mine." The thinking of all great writers, the representatively human quality of genius being inseparable from its intense individuality, is distinctive, involving, in each case, a marked distinctiveness in the report on reality that is conveyed. But, however sharp the differences, the consideration to be stressed by anyone intent on vindicating English as a discipline of thought is that every great writer in the language belongs to the one collaboratively creative continuity. The discipline is not a matter of learning a deduced standard logic or an eclectic true philosophy, but rather of acquiring a delicate readiness of apprehension and a quasi-instinctive flexibility of response. These informed by the intuited living principle, the principle implicit in the interplay between the living language and the creativity of the individual genius. My interplay, which is manifested in the language as the writer uses it, is an intimation that I have in mind my point that a language is more than a means of expression. It embodies values, constatations, distinctions, promptings, recognitions of potentiality. This doesn't mean that it is a product of collaborative creativity. Wait a second. No, I missed a line. This doesn't mean that it is univocal, implicitly dictating an ideal comprehensive conclusion. A product of collaborative creativity, it makes continued and advancing collaborative thought possible. And it will hardly be forgotten that such collaboration entails, vitally and essentially, disagreements. Finality is unattainable. These considerations have obvious bearings on the study, in the spirit represented by the discipline of thought for which I contend, of literature, the supreme creative art of language. Let's go ahead and stop, and before I finish reading I'll go ahead and finish reading our section for today. So, these considerations have obvious bearing on the study in the spirit represented by the discipline of thought for which I contend, of literature, the supreme creative art of language. It is perhaps time to say once more that I haven't the sanguine expectation of one who sees himself as offering a sure prescription, or a prescription at all. The disease that threatens to destroy humanity is truly frightening. One of the most frightening things is that no pointer to the only way in which we could begin the combat against it, no considered account in terms of opportunistic tactics and the principles they represent, will be widely recognized as that. Perhaps it is ceasing to be alleged, crudely and confidently, that F.R. Levis, for instance, thinks that the world can be saved by literary criticism. But this close of a kindly brief notice of my last book is typical of the reception to be expected. Quote, apart from his belief that a good university, which of course would have a good English school, would be a creative center of civilization, however, he has little to offer in the way of dams to hold back the American tide. Let's stop there and see how far we get. Okay, considerations. What considerations is he talking about when he says these considerations have obvious bearings on the study in the spirit represented by the discipline of thought for which I contend, of literature, the supreme creative art of language? Okay, now when I looked back for themes and main ideas, my first thought was human responsibility. Now, in the general sense of our responsibility to do that which we know to be right, I do not think this is one of the considerations that he's talking about. I don't think that's one of them. However, in the narrow sense of the responsibility of creative genius, I do think it is a theme and a consideration. And when we think about what this responsibility entails, there is a phrase, where is it? About their report on reality. Yeah, in the second paragraph that we studied last week, third line, it talks about the marked distinctiveness in the report on reality, which is conveyed by these people. Report on reality. These creative writers, creative geniuses, are the eyes and the mouth that see reality and interpret it out for mankind. And that certainly is a theme in the spirit of represented by the discipline of thought that Levis contends for in studying English literature. Okay, another theme or main idea. Well, this phrase, I don't know if, I think it really, we can consider them all themes. So I'm not going to say it's a main idea or a theme. I'm just going to say these are all considerations. Another one is potency of life. Potency evokes the concept of fatherhood, engendering life, creating life. And it says this human responsibility of creative genius is equated with the potency of life. In other words, if you cut off the creative genius, you will castrate humanity's ability to engender new life in the next generation. Of course, not physical life, but intellectual and moral life. So, certainly, these are considerations in the advocacy of the distinctive discipline of studying English literature deeply. And I say English literature because English literature traces itself back through the Western tradition, all the way back. It could be the literature of any great, rich civilization, but we'll consider English because it's the Western tradition. Okay, so the responsibility of creative genius is the potency of life that engenders new life. And without the study of literature and the effective study of literature, we have, in a sense, castrated, neutered the human race, so there will be no children, no truly human quality of life in all of its potentiality, all that it can be as truly human. Okay, what else? Let's see. Okay, in this whole business of Lawrence knowing that he belonged to something outside of himself, he had the ahnung of what he belonged to, that inkling. This is something I can't just write up easily, but it's something out there that is the light. Maybe it's God. Maybe it's something in the third order. There is truth. I'm going to just write some of those words together. Truth. There is light. There is God. And all of these things, they own the great works of literature. Because the great works of literature reveal and communicate the message of these things to the world. And when the great creative genius says, I know this piece of work is mine, but it is not mine, they're referring to something that's out there that is channeling truth through the writer. Channeling. I'm going to write that and then I'm going to erase it. Channeling. I use that word a lot for this concept. I'm not sure I've spelled it right. I think I haven't. But this word is often used in the occult, when you have a spirit speaking through a medium, like a witch or a witch doctor or something. So this word channeling, it means being a conduit of some other personality communicating through someone. And so the creative genius channels the messages of this, whatever it is out there, this body of truth. Okay, so we have that whole theme of the creative writer knowing that he is not his own. And then, getting into the second paragraph we studied last week, we have the whole idea of the message being distinctive to the genius himself, but also common to all geniuses. All geniuses are communicating the same message. I could almost draw a picture of this, something like this. Well, let me do it this way. Okay, suppose you have all these different creative geniuses, each seeing reality and writing great works that have the ability to show forth reality. and they contribute their work into a message which is coherent and consistent. But it's their unique take on it. And when it comes out, it's still unique. It's part of the message, part of the truth, but it isn't comprehensive. And they don't speak with one voice. Each one has its own unique flavor to give to the message. The messages are all part of the truth. They're all part of it. But each one picks up a bit of its flavor from the individual genius. So they are distinct, but they are also common. Okay? And then there is the whole idea, which is very key, of the collaborative continuity. Of thought. If I had a larger blackboard and I could extend the trunk of this diagram to show that this is a continuity that goes all the way back to ancient times in the Western tradition. This expanse should be seen as years, millennia, thousands of years. It's thousands of years long. And creative minds have been feeding into it all along the way. Creative minds have been feeding in all along the way. The body of information, the body of wisdom, is a coherent unity. But it comes through many voices, many different takes on it, many different works of literature. The whole is the product of collaborative thought. And these individuals are working with language. This entire structure is made up of language. And if you were able to take a cross-section right here, a slice, a cross-section, and examine the language, you would be able to see, just from the language that was used, what the thoughts, the values, the assumptions, the worldviews of the writers were. Just from looking at the language, you would be able to discern some of the thought, because the thought is embodied in the way words are used. Imagine, I don't know if you have enough background to imagine this, but I do. Imagine a slice of literature, literary language, from maybe 1890. 1890. I've read a number of books from that general era. The people were much more reverent toward God, much more reverent toward morality. Much more polite, genteel. They feared God. If you were to take a segment here, 1990, you would see profanity. You would see no fear of God. There is a sort of a sense of familiarity with God. God is my best friend. God is my buddy. God understands and doesn't mind. You would see violence and the bestial nature of man much more evident in the language. You wouldn't even have to read the literature. I mean, just the language itself is so much more raw and crude and less polite and refined. It's also simpler, which shows a lack of sophistication of thought, except when it comes to the technical language, which is way more complex, showing that people have devoted themselves to developing technology, but have neglected philosophy. Just looking at the language. And if you pick out a word, one word, a good word to give as an example, in 1890, if you picked out the word gay, it would have conjured a picture in your mind of ladies and gentlemen, maybe at a picnic in the woods, out in the fields, enjoying nature, untouched, pastoral, innocence and clean, happy fun. Now, 1990, pick out the word gay, and it conjures pictures of something that didn't exist in 1890. Streets at night filled with neon lights of all colors, women selling their bodies, men in expensive and fur coats who are selling drugs and selling the women, and men walking together with men in flagrant and open homosexual lifestyle, completely acceptable. Sex on bulletin boards, sex being advertised in clubs, bathhouses where men can have relations with hundreds of other men anonymously, and all this. Just because of the use of the word. This is embodied in our language, is what our values are. And an author today would pick up this word and would use it perhaps in a new way. Perhaps an author right now, 2011, on the cusp, in 1990, this word meant sex, free sex, homosexual sex, and freedom for this. Maybe in 2010, an author could give the word a sense of the cynicism, the cynicism. I don't know how to spell cynicism. To be a cynic. The destruction of the lifestyle, the tired despair of elderly homosexuals who in 1990 were walking hand in hand with a lover, and in 2011 are dying of AIDS or are simply used up and have nothing. So the word gay in 2011 could be given yet a new spin. So as authors interact with living language, the language changes every step of the way reflecting the cultural changes, reflecting the development of thought. This is a big theme, a big consideration for someone who is interested in putting forth the discipline of the study of English in the way that Levis wants it studied. The consideration is that if you study the literature, you will live in the period and you will imbibe the wisdom as well as the blind spots of a different day. You will take off the blinders of your day and put on the perspective of a different day. And you will connect to the concentrated wisdom of mankind in its corpus, which is the body of language through time, that was collaboratively produced through time. And, all right, so that is the collaborative creative continuity. And then he goes on to say that the discipline is not a matter of mastering a canon, mastering a body of information, or a group of books, or any set curriculum, but rather it is the development of a facility to be able to see that which is subtle in language at any given point. And finally, well, he also says this thing makes the language makes continued collaborative thought possible, and language itself is more than just a medium. It is an embodiment of the thoughts, values, etc. of people. And it does not speak with one voice, but it's coherent. Okay, so those are the considerations that have obvious bearing on the study in the spirit, represented by the discipline of thought for which I contend, of literature. So let us read this sentence and understand it with all this in our mind. First, we find the core of the sentence. These considerations have obvious bearing on the study of literature. These considerations, by which I want you to picture the last board filled. These considerations conjures in your mind all of the thoughts we talked about a minute ago. These considerations have obvious bearing, and I think it is obvious to us now, on the study, and then we skip something, of language. And then we skip something. So, this is the core. These considerations have bearing on the study of language. Hold on one sec. Just 1 second. Okay. These considerations have bearing on the study of language. Now, obviously, that is true. What have we left out here? There is a phrase that says, in the spirit represented by the discipline of thought for which I contend. I'm going to write that kind of small here. In the spirit of the discipline of thought, right? The spirit represented by the discipline of thought. For which I contend, right? I found this phrase a little bit hard to understand at first, but it's much clearer to me now. First of all, the entire phrase modifies study. It's adjectival. So they say, these considerations have obvious bearing on the study of language. A lot of people study language. Are they all thinking the thoughts Levis is thinking? No, I can tell you, because I studied language in graduate school, linguistics. There was nothing like what we're talking about here in that study. No, we only speak of those who study language, i.e. study English literature, in the spirit represented by the discipline of thought, for which I contend. Okay, first, for which I contend. It identifies the discipline of thought. Okay, Levis is contending for a discipline of thought. What is the discipline of thought he is advocating? Okay. It is the careful and thorough study of literature with the idea that literature embodies wisdom on the human experience that can be gleaned to nourish the soul and to create wisdom and full humanity in the reader. Okay, so that, the discipline of thought, is the style of studying literature. All right, the discipline of thought. Okay, in the spirit represented by this discipline of thought. Okay, so this discipline of thought, this type of study, represents the spirit in which they want people studying. So, if it's like in the spirit means with the attitude. This is like an attitude. If someone studies English with this attitude, what attitude? Well, the attitude represented by the discipline of thought that Levis is contending for. Levis wants people to study in a certain way. They will study in a certain way if they have this spirit or this attitude. Okay, I think this is kind of hard to understand, but it seems clear to me now. So, the study with the proper attitude and the proper method. Okay, so these considerations have obvious bearing on this kind of study of language. So, when you see the word study, he wants to make sure you understand that it's not just any study of English, it's the kind of study he advocates which takes the form of the discipline of thought, which is his way of training thinking by looking at literature. And this method represents an attitude or a spirit of scholarship that informs this study of language. And then finally, what did we leave out over there? The study of language, of literature. The word is literature, not language. That should have been literature. And what's in that little bracket? The supreme creative art of language. Referring to literature, it tells us that Levis refers to it as the supreme creative art of language. So he doesn't feel that poetry is the supreme creative art of language. Literature. So he's just giving us more information of what he considers literature to be. Okay, let us continue. It is perhaps time to say once more that I haven't the sanguine expectation of one who sees himself as offering a sure prescription, or a prescription at all. Okay, remember in the early portions of this class when we were talking about curricula and how to structure a school, and Levis was saying he didn't have a set curriculum. He wanted to train teachers to mold minds through literature. He's saying again, he doesn't have a sure prescription or a prescription at all. A prescription is something that you tell a person to do in order to bring about an end. Many times prescription means medication that you take if you are sick, and it should heal you. But in this case, he's talking about educational advice. He says he doesn't have a system of education that will fix the problem. He doesn't have any answers to fix the problem. Not only does he not have a sure prescription, one that he relies upon and is sure will work, he doesn't have any prescription at all. That's kind of too bad. Moving on. The disease that threatens to destroy humanity is truly frightening. When I read that sentence, truly frightening, it conjured an image in my mind of what is truly frightening to me. When I look at my sons and the world that they are living in, and I'm going to say the quality of thought, but really what I mean is the inability to think of so many of the young people around my sons, I wonder what will happen to America. And when I think about how the whole world seems to be in the grip of this kind of mental evil that has taken over the philosophies of the world, I wonder if the world is going to end, if these are the last days prophesied in the Bible. It's hard for me to imagine that civilization will continue as we know it for much longer. And that's just me looking at my own sons and the people around us. I wonder what Levis meant when he said, the disease that threatens to destroy humanity. It would be interesting to me if you would stop the tape and answer that question and email it to me. And then I will share next week what some of you have said. The question is, what is the disease which threatens to destroy humanity? Do you find it frightening? I'll write down the question. And why? So this is homework. Okay, so this homework you can do right now before we finish today's class. You stop the transmission and write down your opinion. In your opinion, not what Levis says, what you think. What disease, if any, threatens to destroy humanity? When I say if any, that suggests that a possible answer is there is no disease that threatens to destroy humanity. Okay, that's what if any means. But if you believe there is a disease threatening to destroy humanity, in your opinion, what is it? What is threatening humanity? And does it truly frighten you? Why or why not? So it's your opinion, your feelings. And send it to me at margarita.noyes. I suppose should we go for the Seminario de Filosofia address? Okay, so I'm going to write the email address right here. Do they all know that? Okay, send it to me at margarita.noyes@seminariodefilosofia.org. Okay? So through Olavo's website email. Okay? And I'll share some next week if I get some good ideas. All right, well, let's continue. Okay, I'm on page 50. Moving on. One of the most frightening things is that no pointer to the only way in which we could begin the combat against it, no considered account in terms of opportunistic tactics and the principles they represent, will be widely recognized as that. Okay. Tricky, tricky grammar. One of the most frightening things is that no pointer to the only way in which we could begin the combat against it. Okay, the only way in which we could begin the combat against it will be widely recognized as that. Okay, so the core of the sentence. One of the most frightening things is that no pointer, skip something, will be recognized as that. As that refers to the word pointer. No pointer will be recognized as a pointer. No pointer will be recognized as a pointer. When you are hiking in the woods in America, we have a way to mark a path. It's called blazes. If you are walking in a wilderness area of America, we have large, miles and miles and miles of wilderness with trails and paths that can go up and down the East Coast, the Appalachian Trail. Hundreds and hundreds of miles. The path is marked by blazes. Blazes are pointers that point to the path. Now, a blaze is something which is done to a tree. For example, if you have a tree on the path, and the path goes this way, maybe there will be a yellow paint stripe made of a color like yellow. And on this tree you see a yellow stripe. Then you keep walking, and a long way over here you see another tree with another yellow stripe. And then another half mile down you see another tree with another yellow stripe. So the yellow blaze marks that path. It points to a particular path. Now, In other times, sometimes a blaze, they don't use blazes that are painted. Sometimes it could be someone who just takes a machete and goes whack and hits the tree. And that marks the path. And you have to watch for machete marks. There are all kinds of ways to point to a path. If you are lost in the woods and you see maybe a rock against a tree, and you don't recognize that that rock is pointing toward the way you should go, then you'll never find your way out. The pointer is not recognized to be a pointer. The frightening thing about being lost is if you cannot recognize the guide that can show you the way out. One of the most frightening things is that no pointer will be recognized as that. So, what have we left out? A long phrase. One of the most frightening things is that no pointer to the only way in which we could begin to combat against it. Okay? So, no pointer to the only way in which we could begin the combat against it. Okay? One of the most frightening things is that no pointer to the only way in which we could begin the combat against it. Then there's another something here that we're leaving out another bit. So let's make sure we understand this first. We're talking about the disease that threatens humanity. One of the most frightening aspects of the disease is that no pointer to the only way in which we could begin the combat against it. Okay, so we have to begin. That suggests that the combat against this disease has not yet begun. And the only way in which we could begin suggests there's only one way to combat the disease. So, one of the most frightening things is that no pointer to this will be recognized. So it's like my tree with the rock here. The rock is the pointer to the only way out, and it is not recognized as a pointer. Therefore, there is no way out. That's a frightening thing. Now, what else have we left out? No considered account in terms of opportunistic tactics and the principles they represent. Opportunistic, no considered account in terms of the opportunistic tactics and the principles they represent. No considered account. In terms of opportunistic tactics. and the principles they represent. Okay, now, the way it is set up with this piece and this piece juxtaposed as they are suggests that these two are closely related. Usually the second is another way of stating the first. In other words, they are the same thing looked at from different angles. So no pointer to this or this will be recognized as a pointer. So let's look at this. Considered account. Considered means thoughtful strategy. Account. An account is a complete representation. So a thoughtful and complete plan in terms of opportunistic tactics. So if you look at the problem and you see, we could combat it this way. Let's take advantage of this chance, this opportunity. So no considered account in terms of opportunistic tactics, ideas of what we can do to combat the problem, and the principles they represent. They, meaning the opportunistic tactics, the principles they represent. Will be recognized as what they are. So no considered account of opportunistic strategies and the principles they represent will be considered to be what it is, will be recognized. No pointer will be recognized as a pointer. No one will see a way we could begin the combat. No one will recognize the validity of an account like this. So all of this is one of the most frightening aspects of the disease, that nobody can see what the problem is and how to get out of it. And it says will be widely recognized. Widely recognized. Obviously, it is recognized by a few people, or we wouldn't be here. Okay. Perhaps, I'm reading again, it is ceasing to be alleged, crudely and confidently, that F.R. Levis, for instance, thinks that the world can be saved by literary criticism. I found that to be a very funny line. The idea that anyone would think that the world could be saved by literary criticism sounded so adorable, so cute. An English professor in his study thinking to save the world by plying his craft. But Levis is actually putting it forth as a serious suggestion. And from a philosophical point of view, he certainly has a point. But in context, he is saying one of the most frightening things is that people are losing their capacity to be afraid of the disease and losing their capacity to recognize measures which would combat against the disease. And an example of this is the fact that they are ceasing, they are stopping to say with wonder that F.R. Levis thinks you can save the world through literary criticism, because they are no longer recognizing that this is a way to combat the disease. They don't recognize it anymore. And they don't recognize the tactics or the principles. They're becoming blind. And because people are becoming blind to these things, they no longer say, F.R. Levis thinks you can save the world by literary criticism. But, reading again now, this close of a kindly brief notice of my last book is typical of the reception to be expected. So let's not read it quite yet. Let's put it in context. If people are not recognizing the danger, people are increasingly not recognizing the remedy, people cannot understand how to combat the disease and the principles of why these tactics would work, then they would say things like this in their criticism of his books. This type of sentiment is becoming more typical of the reception of Levis's communication. And this is what was said. Apart from his belief that a good university, which of course would have a good English school, would be a creative center of civilization, however, he has little to offer in the way of dams to hold back the American tide. Basically, what that quote is saying is that Levis has nothing to offer, which suggests that they cannot recognize the only way that you can combat the problem, and they cannot recognize even a considered account of tactics and principle, tactics against the disease and the principles that the tactics represent. They say Levis has nothing to offer because they can't understand what he does have to offer. Apart from his belief that a good university would be a creative center of civilization, Levis has nothing to offer. So the fact that they say apart from his ideas about the good university means that the critics still recognize that a good university is part of the prescription. But aside from that, Levis has nothing to offer. That's what the critics see. He has little to offer in the way of dams to hold back the American tide. When they say dams to hold back the American tide, first of all, you don't dam up a disease, you cure it. So the analogy is very different. These critics are thinking we want to hold something back, not cure it. Secondly, they're calling the disease the American tide. Next week we're going to talk about what they mean by that. Somehow the American tide is identified with what Levis calls the disease that is threatening humanity. So, send me homework and see what you think the disease is. And next week we will talk more about the American tide. And I'm hoping to put out some greetings to you from the party tomorrow. And I invite you to also send me another piece of homework, and that is a list of what you are thankful for to God. So I'll write that down too. And I'll do this one too and share it with you next week. Homework number 2. What do you thank God for? Send it to me by email, and we'll talk about it tomorrow, next week. Bye-bye.